Hola. Good afternoon. Such a pleasure to be here again at the Palm Beach Poetry Festival. And I'm happy to give what amounts to not necessarily a manifesto. In fact, it's kind of basic, but you always got to find new ways of framing one's pedagogy. And I am a great believer in metaphor and figuration as markers of poetry, particularly that thing that distinguishes us from prose writers. This comes from a much longer piece that I am writing, but I had to cut it down to 30 minutes, and I'm going to go exactly 29.9 minutes, seconds. Okay, I'm putting on this so that, what a pleasure to join Jessica in her talk, because I'm definitely someone who is a bit of a romantic and need all the help I can get. Okay, the stirrings of this talk began after completing Mark Doty's terrific book in the series by Grey Wolf, The Art of Description, a handsome, charming, near pamphlet because of its size, in which he definitely meditates on the role and meaning of description in poetry by critically assessing poems by Elizabeth Bishop, Ezra Pound, Jean Valentine, among others, then compellingly confesses this of contemporary poetry, quote, "I can thumb through whole books of recent poems with very little evocation of sense perceptions within them. Why is this the case? Which is to say, poets today almost never undertake the project of revealing what or how they see the external world, and definitely not with the same intense concentration as one of his forebears, Elizabeth Bishop. Initially, I took offense by such a claim. Nothing rankles me more than totalizing remarks about poetry, but upon reflection, realized that much of the poems I pass on as an editor is owed exactly to that, a failure to penetrate lived experience in language that is resonant, probing, and memorable. I am almost always left with the feeling by poems in that the writer never intrepidly struggled with language or form, for that matter, as a way of amplifying their themes or rendering durable their subject matter. I often have to side with that famous poetry critic who states, in the absence of the, quote, exasperating, obsessive, and often heroic struggle of writing verse, poems otherwise expressed in ordinary and undistinctive language, they just melt away. Poems are memorable when they provide sufficient details and context rather than a presentation of the writer's feelings abstracted in language and triggered by some anecdote, or worse, a presentation of tedious, overwritten, overworked passages that feel uncurated, rhythmically, syntactically, or emotionally. The failure of most poems is a result of the writer's inability to follow the principles of selection. Poets who only select a few general terms appear to have deadened senses, or those who overwrite appear to number grass blades in the backyard, or to count the number of streaks on a tulip, as Dr. Johnson phrased it. This talk is for the purposes of promoting more frequent use of engaged descriptive sketches in poetry, and to explore the various ways poets achieve vividness and memorability in their works, most especially through figuration, but also too, I think I am advocating for poets to write toward a vision of the unknown by closely examining the known, as we are in desperate need of new ways of seeing, of framing, of understanding ourselves beyond the prison of cliched language and speech, manipulated during this time of the year such that to our peril also blinds us to one another and to our planet Earth and her dwindling resources. One of the truly great miracles of language and our profession as poets, but which holds true, of course, for essayists and fiction writers, is our ability to neurologically strike up in a reader a physical experience of having eaten cold plums from a refrigerator, or of sitting in a waiting room in the middle of winter in central Massachusetts, or of standing in front of a Vietnam War memorial as a plane flies overhead, seen in black marble. We ask readers to see what we see, smell what strikes our noses, to engage the sensory world by relying on their own storage of memories, or by constructing new experiences if wholly unfamiliar to them. How is it that words with all of their cultural and varied contexts and meanings can call up sensate experiences lodged in the brain, which then extract similar experiences and patterns by which to compare or differentiate? Since modernism's injunction to avoid the emotive excesses of romanticism and to, quote, treat the thing directly, whether subjective or objective, and to use absolutely no word that does not contribute to the presentation, American poets more or less have defined their approach to writing poems by either resisting riffing or subscribing to the doctrine of thingness. As Alan Schuchard writes, modernist poets, especially Wallace Stevens and William Carlos Williams, sought to, quote, fashion a poetry from the physical world that surrounded them. Stevens, he tells us, saw poetry as a kind of substitute religion, and the poet a high priest who wanted to abstract essences from the world of daily experience that would enable him to recreate life on a level of what he called a supreme fiction. Stevens wrote, "Reality is a cliche from which we escape by metaphor. Through metaphor and the intensities of opulent language, reality, mediated through the imagination, is intensified. A life of the mind that enhances the sometimes drab actualities of the physical world." Of late, I have begun to theorize, however, that the difficult act of composing verse has far more at stake than the mere act of holding up a mirror. That the painstaking act of searching, selecting, patterning, and ordering language puts us into such states of meditation that lead us towards insights for sure, but also, if we listen deeply enough, to solutions, to life-enhancing prayers, to fuller portraits of ourselves and each other, often hidden beneath the layers of banal existence and marked moments of trauma. If we merely write about those surface layers of this happened or that happened, we run the risk of writing poems that are, quote, heightened from life yet paralyzed by fact. It's my belief, if we listen deeply to the groundswell of existence encoded in language, we can hear our future, ourselves, inside its sounds. This imagining what we cannot see is really a kind of deep listening of the soul in order to see clearly. William Carlos Williams points to that difficulty, to the difficulty yet value of this kind of deep listening that engages fully the senses. He writes, "The imagination moves from one thing to another, but the thing that stands eternally in the way of good writing is always one: the virtual impossibility of lifting to the imagination those things which lie under the direct scrutiny of the senses, close to the nose. It is this difficulty that sets a value upon all works of art and makes them a necessity." Even then, Mark Doty states, we can never, of course, fully capture the world or things that as they are in language. And there's all kinds of linguists who will tell us this as well. All perception is limited, he states. No matter how acute your eyesight, how sharp the hearing, how sensitive the sense of touch, what we can take in is a partial rendering of the world. All accounts are partial. So why then bother? Because we are compelled as writers to overcome speechlessness, the inadequacies of words, their limitations. He states, we have nothing else, and when words are tuned to their highest ability, deployed with the strengths the most accomplished poets bring to bear on the project of saying what's here before us, well, it is possible to feel, at least for a moment, language clicking into place into a relation with the world that feels seamless and inevitable. At that instant, when language seems to match experience, some rift is healed, some rupture momentarily solved, and what Hart Crane called the silken, skilled transmemberment of song. Robert Lowell's poem, Epilogue, the closest we get to an ars poetica from the great poet, articulates the ambition of late Lowell. It is his last published poem in his volume Day by Day, published the same month of his death, but also the ambition of writers today. Epilogue. And forgive the canonical examples here. I feel like we should, my hope is that you've encountered these poems before, and returning to them will allow some kind of shared arrivals of their meanings. Epilogue. Those blessed structures, plot and rhyme, why are they no help to me now? I want to make something imagined, not recalled. I hear the noise of my own voice. The painter's vision is not a lens. It trembles to caress the light. But sometimes everything I write with the threadbare art of my eye seems a snapshot, lurid, rapid, garish group, heightened from life, yet paralyzed by fact. All's misalliance. Yet why not say what happened? Pray for the grace of accuracy Vermeer gave to the sun's illumination, stealing like the tide across a map to his girl, solid with yearning. We are poor, passing facts. Warned by that to give each figure in the photograph his, her living name. His, her, they living name. Lowell gives voice to the limitations of art to record our lives. Even as the speaker is preoccupied and beset by memories, he wants to put his imagination to work, to do more than play secretary to his life, merely recording play by play, day by day, the mundane details of living, sometimes everything I write with a threadbare art of my eye, ... all's misalliance. That paralyzed by fact signals to readers the difficulty of mere transcription, alone to serve as a catalyst for transcendence. Yet the speaker gives over, realizes it is enough to realistically render in descriptive language those passing literal and figurative details, poor because the lack of vividness, but also the inherent wretchedness of existence. And what gives value to such portrayals is the accuracy and act itself, which bestows a benevolence and redemption to life in itself. Without it, we die without the dignity of art. Poetry and its tools are not enough alone to capture or caress the miracle of existence. What we need and can only hope for is grace, and one can almost hear divine grace in approaching the task of enlivening our art with the same embodiment and force of life, particularly as we attempt to name in the book of life those who truly are poor passing facts, those who are unseen at the margins of middle-class existence, the dispossessed, those without 900-year-old names or found in our social registers. Garrett Hongo's patient discursive description in the legend achieves a level of exactness and precision that not only embodies the tragedy and force of life, but arguably collapses perception and vision, observation and invention in the interest of giving those in the photograph their living names. The legend. In memory of J. Kashawamura. In Chicago, it is snowing softly, and a man has just done his wash for the week. He steps into the twilight of early evening carrying a wrinkled shopping bag full of neatly folded clothes and, for a moment, enjoys the feel of warm laundry and crinkled paper, flannel-like against his gloveless hands. There's a Rembrandt glow on his face, a triangle of orange in the hollow of his cheek as a last flash of sunset blazes the storefronts and lit windows of the street. He is Asian, Thai or Vietnamese, and very skinny, dressed as one of the poor in rumpled suit pants and a plaid mackinaw, dingy and too large. He negotiates the slick of ice on the sidewalk by his car, opens the Fairlane's back door, leans to place the laundry in, and turns for an instant toward the flurry of footsteps and cries of pedestrians. As a boy, that's all he was. Backs from the corner package store, shooting a pistol, firing it once at the dumbfounded man who falls forward, grabbing at his chest. A few sounds escape from his mouth, a babbling no one understands, as people surround him, bewildered at his speech. The noises he makes are nothing to them. The boy has gone, lost in the light array of foot traffic, dappling the snow with fresh prints. Tonight, I read about Descartes' grand courage to doubt everything except his own miraculous existence, and I feel so distinct from the wounded man lying on the concrete. I am ashamed. Let the night sky cover him as he dies. Let the weaver girl cross the bridge of heaven and take up his cold hands. The poem was written while Garrett Hongo, alone in a hotel room, encountered the news story of an anonymous Asian man shot on the street in Chicago. Cities are often alienating places. However, in the act of describing the evening, the Asian man engaged in the basic domestic act of laundering clothes and his subsequent tragedy, Hongo arrives at a moment of self-definition when the speaker, in the later half of the poem, works to interpret such a senseless killing and finds himself ashamed at the privilege of philosophizing the loss of a man. What we know that the poem illustrates is that description itself can be a moment of achieving self-portraiture. We are defined by what we see, and what we see defines us. As we popularly say, seeing is a statement of personality. Hongo here enacts a distinct, modulated, repertorial sketch of the Asian man, and in so doing, humanizes his existence, but not before reaching toward metaphor, allusion, to nuance our vision of him. There's a Rembrandt glow on his face, a triangle of orange in the hollow of his cheek as a last flash of sunset blazes the storefronts and lit windows. Hongo shows us the power of sustained attention when we set out to find language that works to elevate the banal, or such shocking moments that are all too frequently rendered habituated when reported on the evening news and thus devoid of humanity. The poem supplants the news story. The legend is built on a careful amount of external description: the winter night, a warm shopping bag of folded clothes, the Asian man's physique, the ice-slicked road. What is admirable, of course, is how Hongo takes the few details of the news story to build this scene, to imagine, to dignify the life of a man on a street. The life of a man the people on the street see merely as some wounded Asian, alienated by his otherness, speaking a language foreign to them. Unfortunately, this is the subjective relationship we have to each other in America. Nonetheless, the legend is as much a portrait of the inner life of the speaker in the poem. I've always marveled at the performance of absorption achieved only by the process of mental immersion that great description requires. There's a tension of presence. The speaker, to some extent, needs to fade behind the description in order for the man to emerge as seen by us, the reader. And yet, too much flash, too much cleverness of metaphor can tilt the poem towards more a performance of poetics than a moment of engaged empathy. I think there's a balance here with such passages as he negotiates the slick of ice, the boy has gone, lost in the light array of foot traffic, dappling the snow with fresh prints. We as readers are brought further and further into this scene. Once we are absorbed in the drama of the poem, we too experience the speaker's mental and emotional swirl as a temporal rupture in time, a lyric space in which the speaker muses about his shame and ultimately wishes the wounded, deceased man to heaven, embedded and held in that beautiful mythological tale of the weaver girl who weaves together all existence. By poem's end, we are somehow altered and understand description and poetry as an intervening meditation that helps us to understand such meaningless acts of violence. Hango creates a poem that also honors the temporal frame of inwardness, description of the outer world that allows the speaker and the legend, and thus all of us as readers, to reflect and transform, to gain some moment of enlightenment, that stay against confusion. I'm looking at the time. I'm going to zoom through this. This poem, let's see, I want to run for it. This poem allows us to transition to discussing a very popular means by which poets render even more precise the world around them, and that is figuration. I am attempting to work through a theory of the relative balance between descriptive language and figurative language in a poem. In most poems, the scale does tip towards description, but in poems in which figuration is high, the poet is likely to create a more complex utterance that performs at a high level of lyricism that is linguistically rich and dense. Poets, fortunately, dramatize everyday experience and elevates language beyond the ordinary. When they do this, figuration allows for a stylization of language that reflects the poet's unique vision of the world. And because the poem is often compressed language that aims to give voice to the grandeur of existence, poets often turn to metaphor and other figurative language, similes, puns, allusions, metonymity, to describe, but also and to invite other connotative meanings that insinuate and give the poem breadth and significance. Here is Ruth Stone's Winter, one of many poems the late great poet wrote to mark the grief of losing her husband's death. Because metaphors are propositions, as cognitive scientists George Lakoff and Mark Johnson assert, we can test their mettle, their veracity, their truthfulness, and either reject them or have them shape our understanding of our lives. In their classic book, The Metaphors We Live By, they assert the metaphorical concepts that govern our thoughts are not just matters of the intellect. They also govern our everyday functioning, down to the most mundane details. Stephen Dobbins adds, in Best Words, Best Order, reverses the action of metaphor when he says, it is relying upon readers recognizing and responding to the world of the poem through the authenticating act of memory. In either event, metaphors force readers to actively participate in the construction of the poem, construction of the world inside the poem. As with description, such language gives you a sense of the poet's unique personality, history, and proclivities, especially as they attempt to uniquely connect the world around them and thus ritualizing the act of seeing. Winter. The 10 o'clock train to New York, coaches like loaves of bread powdered with snow. Steam wheezes between the couplings. Stripped to plywood, the station's cement standing room imitates a Russian novel. It is now that I remember you. Your profile becomes the carved handle of a letter knife. Your heavy-lidded eyes slip under the seal of my widowhood. It is another raw winter. Stray cats are suffering. Starlings crowd the edges of chimneys. It is a drab misery that urges me to remember you. I think about the subjugation of women and horses, brutal exposure, weather that forces, that strips. In our time, we met in ornate stations arching up with 19th century optimism. I remember you running beside the train, waving goodbye. I can produce a facsimile of you standing behind a column of polished oak to surprise me. Am I going toward you or away from you on the train? Discarded junk of other minds is strewn beside the tracks, mounds of rusting wire, grotesque pop art of dead motors, senile warehouses. The train passes a station. Fresh people standing on the platform, their faces expecting something. I feel their entire histories ravish me. I think it is a mark of genius and superb gift to create verbal effects that build an organic structure and a satisfying curve of emotion. The poem swells into a revelatory moment of both anguish and visceral longing, of absence and loss. It is this brief lyric poem. In this brief lyric poem, figuration provides both structure and drive. Train cars are compared to loaves of bread. Memory of the deceased husband's head reoccurs as the tip of a letter knife, which might also give some indication of how Walter Stone died. A train station waiting room imitates a Russian novel, a terrific allusion possibly to Anna Karenina, another story about grief, love, and culminating suicide. The blending of literal description and figuration serves as the engine by which the speaker desperately searches to locate the exact images that give portrait to her heartache and loss. It's as if Stone attempts to build her inner world through a series of analogues that explains how grief lives inside the body and memory. There's a balance of approach that transformed the poem to a kind of resolution, owed both to description, stray cats are suffering, starlings crowd the chimneys, and her series of implied comparisons. I think about the subjugation of women and horses, brutal exposure, weather that forces, that strips. I wish someday to see a draft of this poem in order to track Ruth Stone's subconscious and arrival at the sources of these lines. As the poem reached towards its climax, it loads and collects images that feel almost riotous, yet also an organic flowering, what Robert Bly terms in his necessary book, Leaping Poetry, an ecstatic widening of associations. The images construct each other. The train coaches leads to the raw winter, which reminds the poet of Russian novels, women, train stations, discarded junk on tracks, the grotesque pop art of dead motors. According to Bly, such leaps of images are pathways into the psychic woods of the imagination that demythologizes intelligence as the primary source of a poem's creation and puts at center of the poem's architecture a poetry of flying. The figuration gives the poem its terrifying frame, but also in my mind begins to construct a self, a lyric self, that expresses explicitly loss, grief, and pain. I will close by saying each of you, as an apprentice to this great art, must decide how description works in your poems, conveys meaning. How will it serve as a marker of your relationship to language? This is not about possessing a big vocabulary or some specialized nomenclature. Very simply, what kind of precision and accuracy do you want to achieve in conveying your worlds? How does the poem reproduce, account for, picture, portray, trace, or parcel out, to use Willard Spiegelman's list of what poets do when they describe? He asks in his terrific book, from which I have been cribbing quite a bit here, how poets see the world, the art of description in contemporary poetry. How does one take the measure of the external world, which, to return to Mark Doty, is an act of encoded desire? Thank you.
Hello. Wow, that was incredible, Major. Thank you. Can we, yeah. I don't know why you all are not at the beach right now, but thank you for being here. Okay, blah, blah, love. Let's get into it. I was teaching an intro to creative writing course many years ago when I received one story too many story that started, I woke up late, I went to a party, I hooked up with a hot girl. I came to think of this as the frat boys' Veni Vidi Vici. Yeah, and then alongside that, there were all of these love poems that had abstract superlatives and descriptions of gazing into another's soul. So I had a little talk with my students about the difference between an anecdote and a story. If you go on a picnic and the sun shines and the food is delicious and you hold your sweetheart's hand the whole way back to the car, that is a lovely moment. A charming anecdote, but it is one hell of a boring story. However, if you go on a picnic in what you think is an empty field, only to turn and see that you are shaking out your red blanket in what happens to be the pen of a very angry bull who's coming right at you, and then you risk your life by helping your sweetheart be the first one over the fence, and instead of thanking you, she berates you for this act of poor planning, which is just oh so like you, and you pause thinking getting gored to death sounds better every moment. That's a story. Stories, like poems, need tension. They need characters driven by desires that are in some way thwarted, by themselves, by circumstance, or by others. They must allow in variations in circumstance and character and not just adhere to the expected, which makes them fall into cliché. Stories, I told them, can't just be a record of what happened, but must show some evidence of change. And they need to continue even once the final word is spoken. Their significance speaking to people and places and concerns beyond the scope of their mere facts. But then I began the manuscript from which I read some poems last night, and the summary of what I was trying to write was, I love her and she loves me too. I mean, what could be more delicious picnic on a beautiful day? What could be more common, more boring than a group of poems about a happy marriage? Because let's be honest, love, and especially the joy of it, is hard to wrestle down from its flight onto the page, which is why so many love poems live in the land of broad generalizations, less poems than billboards, big words with nothing much behind them, forgotten as soon as they've flashed past. Writing sorrow is in many ways easier. Loss and pain fix moments in our memory like a photographic stop bath, leaving us with a searing set of mental snapshots over which to linger and pine. Small keepsake moments etched into our sad brains, our broken hearts. The beloved's eyes, blue as light refracted through a clear pond. The particular kindness of their hands, now lost. As Neruda wrote, love is so short, forgetting is so long. The sharpness of sorrow is like the slice of a blade. That same bright, wide-awake shock of pain, that same slow knitting back together that is healing, and the scar that remains. But joy? Well, joy is the strong heat of a summer day that sears your chest wide open, making the whole day pass in a blur of heat and pleasure. Joy is something that races through you like the afternoon wind through the trees, all that shake and rattle in the branches, but no real evidence of its passage, every leaf still firmly on its stem. So I went on a quest to find poems of love and joy that avoided the pitfalls of over-sentimentality and cliché, and then to try and decode how they managed this astonishing feat. I wanted poems that went beyond anecdote, to unearth the deeper truths of what we're searching for when we enter into relation with another person, Or like this first poem from Ross Gay, into deeper relationship with not another person, but with the natural world, and as a result, with ourselves. So these are going to go in order, so this should be the first one for you. Thank you. If you find yourself half naked and barefoot in the frosty grass, hearing again the earth's great sonorous moan that says, you are the air of the now and gone, that says all you love will turn to dust and will meet you there, do not raise your fist. Do not raise your small voice against it. And do not take cover. Instead, curl your toes into the grass. Watch the cloud ascending from your lips. Walk through the garden's dormant splendor. Say only, thank you, thank you. This poem, through the use of second person, addresses the reader directly, implicating us and drawing us in. We're grounded immediately in the sensual and specific, half naked and barefoot in the frosty grass, with the earth not just moaning, but moaning sonorously. And what does this moan tell us? It tells us the hard truth, that death is always here, that we and all those we love will eventually turn to dust. But after this revelation, Ross does not spend the rest of the poem bemoaning this fate. No, instead, he not only acknowledges mortality, but accepts it, urging us to do the same, to raise neither our fist nor small voice against this reality. Small, because in the face of fate, even the loudest voice is ultimately no more than a whisper. He encourages us to return to the sensual, to description, as Major was talking about, to the deep pleasures of the world, the feel of our toes curling into the grass, our breath a force that creates a rising cloud. He lets us back into the garden, perhaps the original garden, where there is splendor all around us, even if it's the dormant splendor of winter. The flower and fruit still lock tightly in the bare ground and branches. And he reminds us finally that our stance in the world should be one of gratitude. That yes, our time here is brief, but how wonderful to be here at all. But how does this help us write about love? Well, when I was in my very first undergraduate workshop, I had the incredible honor of studying with Jack Gilbert, which was amazing in many ways, but he did take me aside at one point and basically say what amounted to, yeah, nice try, kid, but you really shouldn't be allowed to write about love until you're 30. I was 20 at the time, and this was not what I wanted to hear. I mean, I knew what love was. Here were my big feelings, so shiny and new. They still had the price tags attached to them. I mean, how could that not be the stuff of great poetry? Look at Keats, he died at 25. Jack was not interested. But now that I've managed to make it into my 30s, I think I understand why. When we are young, each new experience, each new feeling is still vacuum-packed and factory-fresh. Its boundaries clearly delineated. So this is happiness, and that way over there, that is heartbreak. Yet as people age, as some of us might know, we are far more likely to experience mixed emotions. A tear in the eye while looking at something beautiful, a tightness in the chest when greeting a good friend. And this range of emotions, evident in Ross Gay's Thank You, is what I believe to be the key to writing poems about love. Though we have this idea of love poems as sweet and light, filled with grand philosophical statements, such one-note works seem false and leave all but the intended recipient cold. Instead, powerful, effective love poems invite in Lorca's duende, acknowledging the light and the dark of the world and all the shades in between. For our lives are never just one thing or the other. This in-between is where we live. Even in moments of deep sorrow, there are hints of joy, just like Ross's dormant splendor, just as even in joyful moments, the aches of the past and potential sorrows of the future are always present. And this, for all of you youthful people out there under 30, perhaps the interns up in the balcony, hello, gritting your teeth and muttering just like I did when I was 20, I think this might be the hack that lowers Jack's estimate by a few years. So, all right. So let's get into love poems. We're going to look at 4 poems together today. The first by Matthew Olsman. He read this last year. Oh yeah, he's great. Mountain Dew commercial disguised as a love poem. Here's what I've got. The reasons why our marriage might work. Because you wear pink but write poems about bullets and gravestones. Because you yell at your keys when you lose them and laugh loudly at your own jokes. Because you can hold a pistol, gut a pig. Because you memorize songs, even commercials from 30 years back, and sing them when vacuuming. You have soft hands. Because when we moved, the contents of what you packed were written inside the boxes. Because you think swans are overrated, because you drove me to the train station, you drove me to Minneapolis, you drove me to Providence. Because you underline everything you read and circle the things you think are important and put stars next to the things you think I should think are important and write notes in the margins about all the people you're mad at, and my name almost never appears there. Because you make that pork recipe you found in the Frida Kahlo cookbook. Because when you read that essay about Rilke, you underline the whole thing, except the part where Rilke says love means to deny the self and be consumed in flames. Because when the lights are off, the curtains drawn, and an additional sheet is nailed over the windows, you still believe someone outside can see you. And one day, 5 summers ago, when you couldn't put gas in your car, when your fridge was so empty, not even leftovers or condiments, there was a single 20-ounce bottle of Mountain Dew, which you paid for with your last damn dime because you once overheard me say that I liked it. Yeah. Woo. In the tradition of Elizabeth Barrett Browning's How Do I Love Thee, Let Me Count the Ways, Matthew has written a list poem, which is a form particularly suited to this subject. Attention is, after all, one of the most basic and essential forms of love. When we love someone, especially in those first heady weeks and months together, love makes explorers of us all. We imagine ourselves the first to discover a particular personality trait, you think swans are overrated, or an aesthetic characteristic, you wear pink. And through this accumulation of details, we hope to demonstrate to the beloved that we know them, while simultaneously creating a portrait for others to also love them too. Yet despite the specificity of its details, this is not just a private gift poem. Though it might seem counterintuitive, the more specific, the more authentic we can make the concrete, sensual details of our love poems, the more a poem will feel universal and resonant to a wide sweep of readers. Each image here of another's beloved triggers in me memories of the specific quirks of the one that I love, making me inadvertently begin a list of my own, just as you might if you try using this poem as a model. And despite its deceptively simple form, from the first, this poem allows in that mandatory shiver of darkness. Here's what I've got, the reasons why our marriage might work. The crucial fulcrum here is the word might, which allows in the ghost of might not, and gives the sense the speaker is not just setting out to make a grocery list of love, but is struggling to convince his wife, or even perhaps himself, that they've got a good thing going. Opening this way gives the poem an inherent urgency, which is then reinforced by the insistent anaphora of because, whose repetition creates a rhythmic pace that pulls you through to the end. But this repetition does not grow monotonous because Matthew varies his list throughout in terms of the lengths of his sentences, the complexity of their syntax, and their tone, humor despite the gravity of what's at stake. And please note too that these are not all positive things, right? Putting the list of things inside the box that you pack might make things a little bit difficult, but through the lens of love, they become endearing. The items listed also show signs of change, increasing in intricacy and intimacy. Quotes from Rilke arrive only after the list of places his wife drove him, and they build toward that final moment, which expands into a scene showcasing an act of attention and devotion, a scene which might seem small if it were the first part of the poem. But as a result of the rich portrait created by all of the details that have come before it, it has a greater significance and meaning. For this is a poem that dwells in concrete examples. Instead of brandishing amorphous abstractions like self-sacrifice, Matthew writes instead, "You spent your last damn dime on Mountain Dew because you once overheard me say that I liked it. If that's not love, I don't know what is." So now let's look at Dorian Lux's Fast Gas. Fast Gas for Richard. She read this here 2 years ago. Before the days of self-service, when you never had to pump your own gas, I was the one who did it for you. The girl who stepped out at the sound of a bell with a blue rag in my hand, my hair pulled back in a straight, unlovely ponytail. This was before automatic shutoffs and vapor seals, and once, while filling a tank, I hit a bubble of trapped air, and the gas backed up, came arcing out of the hole in a bright gold wave, and soaked me, face, breasts, belly, and legs. And I had to hurry back to the booth, the small employee bathroom with a broken lock, to change my uniform, peel the gas-soaked cloth from my skin, and wash myself in the sink. Lightheaded, scrubbed, raw, I felt pure and amazed. The way the amber gas glazed my flesh, the searing subterranean pain of it. How my skin shimmered and ached, glowed like rainbowed oil on the pavement. I was 20. In a few weeks, I would fall for the first time in love. That man waiting patiently in my future like a red leaf on the sidewalk. The kind of beauty that asks to be noticed. How was I to know it would begin this way? Every cell of my body burning with a dangerous beauty, the air around me a nimbus of light that would carry me through the days. How, when he found me, weeks later, he would find me like that. An ordinary woman who could rise in flame. All he would have to do is come close and touch me. Whew, okay. All right, this poem begins with a little narrative, way back in the day, I was the girl, etc. But line 23 begins the volta, the turn, the moment of change where the poem transforms from anecdote into story, into something with inherent tension and a resonance beyond just the facts of what happened. I was 20. In a few weeks, I would fall for the first time in love, which then reverberates back up, making us re-envision those first 22 lines as one half of an unexpected, extended simile. Falling in love is just like getting doused in gasoline. Of course. But upon rereading it, you can see how carefully she planted the seeds of this simile. There's the surprising beauty of the gasoline as a bright gold wave, the sensuality of how it soaked not just random parts of her, but her face, breasts, belly, and legs. And how her feelings of being lightheaded, scrubbed raw with a skin that shimmered and ached, could all be applied to someone in the first throes of love. What makes this comparison especially pleasing is that at first glance, getting soaked in gas is about as far from romance as you can get. If you were to use this poem as a model, try finding something dirty, some concrete action or experience, something with rough edges that will make the comparison to love all the more surprising and enjoyable for your reader. For when we read, we are not just looking for an echo chamber to confirm what we already know. We're looking for something that shocks us into seeing something that we think we know in an entirely new way. Note, too, that Dorian does not just place these two things side by side, x equals y. She uses the final 9 lines to knit them together, teasing out particular similarities between the two experiences. With both love and gasoline, every cell of her body burned with a dangerous beauty. In both, she was an ordinary woman, ready to rise in flame at the touch of either a match or a man's hand. Okay, we are halfway through. We have 2 more poems to go. I'm going to speak a little more quickly. But this is the blah, blah, love part. We're not going to go to the next poem yet, because I want to address some concerns you might be having as you listen to this. Right now, literally right now, there is an impeachment trial of the President of the United States. Parts of the world is on fire. We are on the brink of war, right? There are terrifying things happening. And right now, art and literature can feel inconsequential. I know this feeling well because I was working on my own love poems right as the 2016 presidential election happened. And I don't know how you were feeling, but my wife Nicole and I were distraught. And we were struggling with the feeling that in the face of this new regime, what could be the point of poetry? And what could be more useless than love poems? But fortunately, we had a dinner scheduled with the poet Eleanor Wilner. She was here last year. We got to hear, she's amazing. She is an oracle. I highly recommend sitting down with her. And she was so sweet, and she listened to all of our concerns and was so nice. And then she just said, no. And she gave us a truth that we desperately needed, and so perhaps you need it too. What she said was, poets are the record keepers. We are the ones who write the evidence of what's worth saving, of not just what to fight against, but what is worth fighting for. Like the feminist adage, the personal is political, love poems record what stitches us to this life and makes it worthwhile to continue in the face of cruelty and sorrow, or like Nicole talked about yesterday, of what's happening to our planet. So with Eleanor's mandate in mind, poets are the record keepers, with that generous permission to document the light that lifts us along with the darkness. Let's look at a poignant example of a love poem by our very own Laurent Beausolar. I'm going to try not to mess this up, Laurent. At dawn, crows, their constant beak-clicking, triple-beat squawks. My love, as he sighs, stirs, weighs a wrist or knee on me, then sinks back, coiled into the thick flesh of sleep. The coffee maker's chokes, the garbage truck's brake squeaks. Last night's sweet crumbs of dried out apricot pie. Then light. How it creeps down night's taut rope, lands aslant on the kitchen counter to shellac 2 clementines, shrinking in a chipped bowl. I take note, write it down. Crows, scorn, loves, weight, street sounds, taste, colors, death, charms, crammed into a fraction of dawn. All of this already gone. And I just need to say that many of us in this room know that this documents a moment in a long marriage between Laron and the beloved and much missed poet Kurt Brown. So it was important to say his name. This poem is a classic type of the genre, an aubade, which is a love poem at dawn, versus a serenade, which is a love poem for the evening. Traditionally, an aubade either celebrates or laments the arrival of dawn. Laments specifically in Laron's poem, the parting of 2 lovers no longer under the cover of night, in danger of disappearing under the onslaught of the average day, or ultimately in the death mentioned in that penultimate couplet. In a way, At Dawn is also a Liszt poem. But instead of Matthew striving to win over or win back his beloved, this is a poem in which the speaker struggles to get down on paper as much as possible before her memory of what was shared in the night inevitably fades. Like Ross, Laron does this through acutely observed images grounded in every one of the senses. The sight of first light creeping in, the sound of squawks and sighs, the weight of her love's wrist or knee. What we can imagine are the competing smells of coffee and garbage trucks, and perhaps the taste of a fingertip dipped into the crumbs of that apricot pie. And it's not just the details of these images that are compelling, but the rich language in which they are written, chock full of onomatopoeia, words that sound like what they describe. She doesn't just write about the cawing of crows, but their constant beak-clicking triple beat squawks. The coffee's chokes, the truck's brake squeaks. And as a result, throughout is the dense sonic texture, the music of a poem in which every word was selected so that its sound mirrors its meaning. All of this speaking to the abundance of embodied joy shared between 2 people. There is also a masterful use of enjambment, which is the breaking of a line mid-phrase, where the continued line often changes or comments on the meaning of the line that came before it. Note how in line 9, last night's sweet crumbs hints at luscious bits of memory, evoking an evening of shared intimacy. But those ambrosial indications are undercut when you go on to read it is not crumbs of memory, but crumbs of dried out apricot pie. Similarly, in line 14, you get the lovely images of 2 clementines shellacked in new light. But it's then immediately deflated by the next line, which informs us they are shrinking in a chipped bowl. Both of these enjambed images beautifully mimic great happiness and the sorrow that follows it, the joy of pleasure dogged by the knowledge that such pleasure cannot possibly last. This truth is brought home in the poem's final lines, starting on line 16, which begins, I take note, write it down. Here, the speaker is overtly stating what has been happening all along. She is recording a shorthand list of love, all while acknowledging that the entirety of such shared moments can never be fully captured or revisited, and that even as she writes, all of this is already gone. If you wanted to write in the mode of this poem, you could try and remember one very specific moment of intimacy from your own life. And then, using all of your senses, try to write down remembered images from that moment as quickly as you can. Not worrying about whether they're poetic or in the right mood for love. Remember, Laurent teaches us that a love poem can be expansive enough to contain not just the beloved, but garbage trucks and eventual inevitable loss. Then when you revise, push on the language, trying to find words that contain the texture and music of your memory, making it both a successful poem and your new favorite love song. You're really good at that, Laurent. Thank you. All right, one more short poem. Finally, we will take a look at Halfway by the writer Frank Paino, the only poet who has not been on faculty here at the festival, from this selection. Halfway, for my father. Suddenly, you are no longer here. Nothing else has changed. The machines still hiss and thrum like the wings of impossible insects. Air is forced into your chest so it rises, falls, a good, dependable ocean. But your heart, that intricate, bloody fist, refuses to clench. Beside the bed, your leather slippers rest like rudderless, diminutive ships. Black scars, crypts. If they could let me follow, I'd put the slippers on. But as I cannot go where you are, I will meet you halfway. Tonight, I will hold my love beneath me, grip her hair like dark and supple reins. That good fire growing in my groin, that swift black hearse in my veins. Halfway begins as an elegy for the speaker's father, the word suddenly inviting us into the shock of death, especially when it's set against the relentless dailiness that continues. But this is not just anyone suddenly alone at a deathbed. This is a poet. His father's artificially rising chest is a good, dependable ocean. And his father's heart, that most hallmark of symbols, is not beautiful, but here is an intricate, bloody fist refusing to clench. Frank then picks up that earlier ocean metaphor and transforms his father's empty slippers into rudderless, diminutive ships. Rudderless now that his father will never again fill them. But then he reconsiders. Ships are not enough to convey his grief. So he transforms them again, first into black scars and finally into crypts, each image darker and deeper than the last. He then wishes that they could bring him to his father, knowing they cannot, after which he makes his promise to meet him halfway. But what does he mean by this? Well, here too there is a volta, the poem pivoting from one of grief into one of eroticism and love. Just as there was a sudden absence that began the poem, here there is a sudden leap from hospital room to bedroom, from the speaker and his father to the speaker and his love. But how does this scene connect to what came before? Well, just as before he was wishing those shoes would carry him to his father, now he will grip his love's hair like dark and supple reins, transforming her into a horse, their lovemaking becoming transporting, carrying him where those shoes could not. Arousal becomes a good fire, not unlike a funeral pyre, further marrying carnality and grief. Here is a poem that refuses simple categorization, which feels exceedingly honest. If you were to try an imitation, I'd recommend beginning with an experience that seems as far from love as you can find, and then be open to the strange ways love and desire are actually, often mysteriously, present in that moment. Halfway is a testament to the messy boundarylessness of our lives, encouraging us to take an expansive enough view that we let in all the strange, sometimes taboo juxtapositions of our day-to-day, acknowledging that during grief, we experience desire. That even during the heights of love and sex, we have that swift black hearse racing through our veins. For in the end, if we look closely enough at anything, we can find the nuance, the shading present there. Writing powerful love poems calls for the same work that love itself does. It is a matter of deep embodied awareness, of risking vulnerability by bringing your full self to bear, even those parts that shame you. All of which is what transforms even that delicious picnic on a beautiful day from an anecdote to a story worth writing. Everything has its share of shadows, its share of depth. It's a matter of paying attention and having the courage to write the full truth of what you find. Thank you.
Goodness, I think so many of us are just living in your words, both of you. It was transformative, and so I got to shake the brain to the left side. Yeah. I asked this yesterday of our guests. We use the word poet to describe you, and we would like to know, maybe it's the royal we, how you take that word, poet, if you internalize it, what you do with it, how it feels to you. Could each of you share a little bit about that?
Or I can go first.
I've had the great privilege of meeting a number of my literary heroes who are chiefly poets. Fiction writers are great, but poets seem to always lead the charge. And one of them said something that kind of helps me gauge my work both on the page and off the page as a poet. And he said one has to place oneself in a continuum of consciousness. And I think that finds expression in what we write about, for sure, but also how we pay attention to life as it's happening around us and record it. I also think about the function of the poet beyond the self. And if any of you have the occasion to write a poem celebrating a marriage, or a poem that marks the passage of someone beloved in your community, you start to feel the beautiful weight of that. And so for me, more than doodling on the page, I understand that word not in a kind of capital P, literariness of poet, but someone who is maybe charged with the act of paying attention and recording. And I think of the West African griot, of course, the Djali, the Irish bard. Those are the spaces that I kind of occupy, but, first and foremost, the thing that called me was language itself. And so maybe that's where my orientation is most, where I actualize most before those other roles.
That's beautiful. I think I love that you're talking about community, right, and writing for other people. I grew up a little bit north of here. I grew up as a queer, super nerdy, book-loving kid in Bible Belt, Central Florida. Did not go over super well. And books were what kept me alive. I mean, books and poets were what told me that I would one day be able to live the type of life I knew I wanted to live. And so for me, when I think about being a writer, it's very much about community. If my poems can make one person feel a little bit less alone, then to me that's my accomplishment as a writer. And to recognize that we are always in conversation. We're in conversation with the incredible poets who have come before us, the incredible poets writing right now, and hopefully with the future as well. So.
Hi, I'm in the balcony.
Hi, balcony.
Hi. So I'm wondering, in thinking about great description in a love poem and how you decide how to signal queerness or anything other than the kind, we're in this very white, cis dominated space. And I'm thinking about when you, in your love poem or in your great description, how you signal those things and prioritize those things in your work.
I mean, I guess for me, I grew up reading the poem. I grew up reading the poems of men to women and women to men, primarily. Adrienne Rich was really the only queer writer that I was acquainted with as a young person. So I didn't think, oh, this is a poem from Jack Gilbert to his love, and I'm not a part of that. I read my own loves into those poems. And so for me, it's not so much that I prioritize and, put a disclaimer like, this is a love poem from a woman to a woman only, and that's who it's for, though that is very important and valuable. But what I want to do is I want to write my full experience of love and hope that I can write it in a way that anyone of any, gender, persuasion, sexuality, whatever, can read themselves into that poem, and it will speak to their love.
Think about that wonderful fragment by Sappho. It might be number 14. Can't remember right now. Maybe 31. It's a poem in which you'll recall this. She's sitting on the other side of the room and sees her paramour talking to someone, a man, and the rage, the jealousy that we feel even in our time, just the power of capturing that moment, such that she's physiologically changed. And on one hand, I definitely appreciate the queerness that animates that narrative, but that's a universal thing. Come on, y'all seen some of your partners at a dinner party talking to somebody or somebody engaging them, you're like, let me get over there real quick, intervene that, But it is a question of finding the images that might mark something very distinct about identity and drawing on that. Some of the poets that I read same-sex marriages very much had to practice a poetics of cruising, for example. Like you had to be able to read in between the lines to see how they were signifying a particular kind of experience that was forbidden. And we are enriched by that, enriched by those particular poets. It's almost like in old Hollywood where the censors forbade certain kinds of insinuations, and the writers were able to kind of circumvent it as a result, and somehow it made it richer as a result. And I think that's the power, interesting enough, of metaphor, because it's very much about insinuating and alluding rather than, or telling it slant rather than being direct.
I have a love affair with planet Earth. I love the mountains, the rivers, everything about planet Earth. I have a tree in my backyard which starts my day, and I just totally love that tree. So my question, or my thought is, maybe some giant, given this situation with planet Earth right now, where so much is destructive and horrible, and for those of us who cherish planet Earth, feel real, genuine sorrow. So my thought is, maybe as poets, we should all feel some responsibility, and you poets in particular should feel some responsibility to get information out there. I'm sort of thinking like a modern day Leaves of Grass that y'all could put together, and it would be wonderful, and it would get to the top of the New York Times bestseller list, and people would say, oh my gosh, the earth, I love it, I gotta do something. So I guess it boils down to your thoughts about what I'm saying, and how much you feel responsibility as writers and poets to do something about this horrible situation which we find ourselves in.
I think, well, so Nicole, I don't know if you were at Nicole Brown's talk yesterday about eco-poetry, because I think she addressed this very beautifully. But I do think that poetry in general needs to keep us awake, right? And it needs to, I think what Major was talking about that need for sensual description, right, that lives in your body, I think that what you're saying, right, there's so much devastation, is it makes you want to close your shoulders and shut down and keep your head down and not see anything. And so I think every poem, whether it directly addresses climate change or not, does really important work. Because it reminds us, as Eleanor said, as I quoted her in this talk, that there are things worth fighting for, right? And that's what we have to constantly keep doing is, as Nicole said, hope is a verb, right? We have to do the active work of saying we cannot just despair, we have to commit ourselves to fighting for the things that we love. And hopefully that can help.
The novelist Ann Patchett said that sometimes she feels like she's writing the same story over and over. Sometimes I feel like I'm writing the same poem over and over. Hence why I'm here at Craft Talk. But what's your experience with that, if you have that?
I'm a strong advocate of writing. It's almost like we have to write our obsessions away. We have to get it out. And I think however many poems that takes, that is totally fine. And in fact, I was thinking about Ruth Stone. Ruth Stone has been writing about her, or was writing about up to her passing, her deceased husband. I mean, she just lived with that grief and wrote all different angles at it. And, you know, the question about the climate is an act of, we haven't used this word yet, but it's an act of love to write about the environment, to learn the names of the trees, to find language to give expression to our relationship to each other and the earth. So if it emerges as an obsession, I think that's a great, not necessarily a burden. Eventually, I mean, look at all the books that Sharon Knowles got out of writing about her father, for example. So it's not necessarily a bad thing. In fact, it can be a way of marking territory in the sense that your name would become identified with that, and that's one of the great achievements of being a writer is that somehow you are so authentic with your with something that you do on the page, or with literal subject matter that you are associated with it. So I think it's a good thing.
We have time for one more question.
Do I take it? So I get the idea that this is a vocation for you. And I think of Billy Collins saying, poets sit at their desk and they look out the window at the rain, and, you know, he can be funny that way. So I think of him having a job. His vocation is also his job. So I'm leading up to when you feel like you leave that behind to have your regular life doing other things than your vocation and working, does it ever happen that it just comes, right? Your vocation sneaks back in when you're at other times of your life and not actively writing a poem. And how does that feel?
Hopefully, when you're not at the desk, when you're not created this space to write, somehow you're living a life such that you are honing your senses and allowing yourself, almost training to be ready to kind of perceive the world in such a way that when you do sit down, or if you don't sit down, you find yourself in an airport or a train station, or waiting at a bus stop, or wherever. Why all transport major? Why did I do that?
You've been traveling a lot.
Thank you. I have been. That somehow you're open to the world around you, and I don't know exactly what that means for each individual person, but I've often fantasized a course or a class or a workshop where we don't write poems, but we engage in activities that opens up our bodies and our intellects to perceive the world around us. You asked, how does that feel? It feels amazing, because it's that moment, as some poets have described, as lightning striking, because you didn't plan it, you didn't expect it, and there it came, fully formed. I hope that answers.
Yeah, and I mean, for me, yes, I mean, obviously, like, I have to be sitting down when I'm actually doing the work of writing, but I need to be in my body. And a lot of times when I get stuck as a poet, I go for a run, right? I go out into the woods somewhere, and I want to feel the rhythm of that poem. But then even when I shower and look a little more presentable and come up here, I'm walking down the street, if I am in a receptive place, if I'm in a place where, as you know, I was just saying, that you are awake, right? That you are paying attention, things lodge in me, right? Since I am ready to take in sensations that then will translate themselves in some way into metaphor, that will become a new way of understanding the world, which hopefully I can then give back as a gift to a reader through a poem. So I think that whether or not you're writing, even if you have long periods of time in which your life just doesn't give you time to write, in which you don't feel inspired to write, you are still doing the act of writing, because you are filling up the well that you're going to sit down and dip into when you get back to the page.
All right, everybody. How about hearing for the two brilliant Major Jackson and Jessica Jacobs?